Africa Day began on the 25th of May 1963 with the formation of the Organisation for African Unity, the predecessor of what we now call the African Union. That was a momentous day in Africa's history. No less than 17 countries had won their independence in the preceding 5 years, that is, before that great event in May of '63. This was a great and turbulent and exciting time across the continent. On the 25th of May '63, that first Africa Day, 30 of the then 32 independent African states came together to sign a founding charter in Addis Ababa, which saw a new chapter in Africa's history begin. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Africa Day. 50 years of celebrating hard-fought achievements, of freedom, of independence from colonial oppression for the nations of Africa. We should always reflect on the reality of that colonial oppression. If you have any familiarity with the experiences of the peoples of the continent, this oppression was real, direct, institutional, and personal. And 50 years now of celebrating the diverse and enduring cultures of the African peoples, 50 years of celebrating the unity of the African continent in facing the challenges of the future. So this Africa Day of 2013, we along with nations all over the world celebrate Africa and its remarkable journey over the last half-century. Over the past 5 decades, Africa has come a long way in shaking off its colonial shackles and forging its own bright and confident future. War, famine, and dictators that were once commonplace and seemed to be unavoidable in Africa's past have now become a relative rarity. In recent times, the African economy has gone from strength to strength. And despite the weak global economic environment, the World Bank has estimated that the African continent has now largely recovered from the setbacks of the global financial crisis. The IMF this month forecast economic growth of 5.4% in 2013 and 5.7% in 2014 for the economies of sub-Saharan Africa, noting that it will be among the fastest growing places in the world, second only to developing Asia. Let me say that again. Among the fastest growing regions of the world, second only to Asia. We should drill that into our collective cerebral cortex. World Bank analyses show that about 25% of the countries in Africa, notably Sierra Leone, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso and Rwanda, grew at 7% or higher, putting them in league with the fastest growing countries in the world. This positive economic story rarely makes the newsstands. Good news, relatively, rarely does. Part of the mission of this dialogue here at Latrobe, part of my mission delivering this lecture here in Latrobe University, is to convey this basic economic message to the Australian community at large and to Australian business in particular, that Africa is well and truly open to business. Yes. Africa represents the future. Asia is the present and will be the future for some time to come. Look beyond the decades and you will see Africa rising just as Asia was rising a couple of decades ago. The figures that I've just referred to favourably attest to improved governance standards that African governments have progressively achieved over the past decade or more. The creation of consistent and clear fiscal, legal and regulatory policies and practices has increased greater economic efficiency, predictability and most importantly transparency for government and for business. The positive result has been a significant increase in involvement by the international community in the continent's economic development. Foreign direct investment in Africa is estimated to have climbed to 38 billion in 2012, more than double the figure that we saw back in 2002. Over the past decade, real income per person across the sub-Saharan African region has increased by more than 30%, an astonishing improvement on previous 20 years in which it shrank by nearly 10%. This has been a remarkable decade in Africa's history, the global financial crisis notwithstanding. Whereas currently less than half of Africa's countries have achieved what the World Bank would call middle income status, defined as at least $1,000 per person per year, Africa's average per person income is now $1,700 per year. So if Africa was one country, it would, within the World Bank's definition, now be lying within the middle income bracket. In any event, by 2025, the World Bank expects most African countries to have reached middle income status. Africa has also made significant progress over the past decade on the Millennium Development Goals. Life expectancy across Africa has increased by about 10%. Maternal and child mortality rates in most African countries have been falling steeply. Malarial deaths in some of the worst affected countries have declined by 30%, and HIV infections have declined by up to 74%. Secondary school enrolments grew by 48% between 2000 and 2008, after many states expanded their education programs and abolished school fees. Between 1996 and 2010, the share of people living on less than $1.25 a day in sub-Saharan Africa has declined from an estimated 58% of the population to 48% of the population. Much progress has been achieved, much progress still remains to be achieved. But where progress has been obtained, we should celebrate it, acknowledge it, and to make sure that we communicate it effectively. All these improvements have led the World Bank to forecast that while the region may not meet the Millennium Development Goal targets by 2015, it is on track to achieve them soon after, as long as strong economic growth and a commitment to economic reform remains. This is particularly good news as the African population continues to be one of the fastest growing regional populations in the world, with Nigeria predicted by the UN to overtake the United States by 2055 as the world's third most populous country after India or China. Watch Nigeria in all of its potential and all of its future and all of its current challenges. There will go a large slice, in fact, of the world's future. Despite pockets of civil unrest and conflict, Africa as a whole has become much more politically stable over the past decade, and a growing number of countries have taken steps towards institutionalised democratisation. At the end of the Cold War, only 3 African countries were democratic states. Only 3. Since that time, the number has risen to 25, and many more countries hold worthwhile, albeit not fully, democratic elections. Again, where progress has been achieved, let us acknowledge the reality of that progress, while still being very clear about what progress has yet to be realised. Only 4 African countries do not as yet have a multi-party constitution. These are Eritrea, Swaziland, Libya and Somalia, though the latter 2 are due to get one soon. Further, the number of coups d'etat, which averaged 20 per decade in the period 1960 to 1990, has fallen to an average of 10. This relative stability and economic prosperity in the region has led to a considerably improved standard of living. Africa today has 3 mobile phones for every 4 people, the same as India. Very few people know that fact. By 2017, nearly 30% of households in Africa are expected to have a television set, an almost 5-fold increase over 10 years. Nigeria now produces more movies than the United States of America. Some of them better than Let us focus now on the bilateral relationship between Australia and the continent. Australia also is optimistic about Africa's future. Despite being a relative latecomer to Africa's rise, Australia has been there when it has mattered in Africa's recent history. Let us never forget former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser led our support for the abolition of apartheid in South Africa, which he described as something that is repugnant to the whole human race. And he did so despite opposition from Margaret Thatcher at the time. Again, under Prime Minister Fraser, we are proud to oppose white minority rule in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was then known. Malcolm Fraser deserves recognition for his historical contribution on Africa. My own political engagement with Africa began more than a decade ago on a Commonwealth election monitoring delegation to Zimbabwe, with now Deputy Opposition Leader Julie Bishop. That's where we struck up bipartisanship. That is why over the past 5.5 years, this Australian government has worked hard to step up our engagement right across Africa. Australia today has diplomatic relations with all African countries, with 10 of those relationships established since I became Prime Minister in 2007. Our newest embassy in Addis Ababa, which I was proud to open in 2011, is accredited to the African Union and expands on our overall engagement with this key regional organisation. As Foreign Minister, I also took the decision to set up our first mission in Francophone Africa, in Dakar in Senegal. We have established and strengthened ties with a number of regional African organisations, and our ministers and senior officials have attended African Union summits regularly now since 2008. We're also pursuing membership of the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund to support Australia's efforts to overcome poverty and to achieve the Millennium Development Goals in the continent. With the support of our African friends, Australia last year won also a bid for a non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, the first time that Australia has had such a seat on the Council since 1986. And through you, High Commissioner, if I could thank all of our African colleagues for their support in our candidature on that occasion. Today we have some 337,000 African Australians living with us here in this country. Figures last year also showed nearly 13,000 African students enrolled at Australian educational institutions, and many Australians now live and work in Africa. With this in mind, the government, of which I was then Prime Minister, established the Australia Africa Awards. More than 4,000 Australia Awards have so far been provided to African students. Over the past 3 years, the number of these scholarships available for African candidates has increased tenfold to a total of 1,000 awards each year. The Australian Government today allocates 1,000 awards each year to students from across the continent of Africa to come and choose and study the course of their and their government's preference here in Australian institutions. One quarter of all of our development assistance scholarships are now directed to the continent of Africa. This is a good thing. This is because Australia is committed to developing the capacity and leadership skills of Africans to enable them to contribute effectively to the development of their home countries. We are investing in the human capital of the region to raise up the leaders of Africa's next generation, as well as generating a new and growing African-Australian alumni network, many of whom I've met here this evening at Latrobe. Economically, Australian investment in Africa is also thriving. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade estimates that there is well over $50 billion of current and prospective Australian investment in Africa, particularly in the resources sector. Bilateral merchandise trade with Africa has grown by around 6% annually over the past decade to nearly $10 billion. Last year, Australia appointed a new trade commissioner in Accra, in Ghana, in recognition of these growing business and commercial links. And in 2011, Australia hosted heads of state and heads of government from 20 African Commonwealth countries in Perth for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. As Foreign Minister at the time, I also had the privilege to host my foreign ministerial colleagues from across the continent for the better part of a week. A good time was had by all. One of the great outcomes, however, of that Commonwealth conference was that we launched the Australian Mining for Development Initiative. This is a $140 million development program funded by the Australian Development Assistance Agency, AusAid, that offers our friends from across Africa the opportunity to send their students or their officials or their technical experts to Australian mining schools and mining centres of excellence on short or long-term courses with one objective: to lend a helping hand to the countries of Africa and their governments to make sure that the peoples of Africa get their fair share from the mining developments of the continent. It has driven Australia's economic development in decades and centuries past. It will be a huge driver of Africa's economic development in decades to come. We therefore believe this is an important program. It is an unparalleled program across the world. When I spoke of this program recently at the Davos Economic Summit in Switzerland, most other governments scratched their head as to why a significant investing country such as Australia would do that, given we have so many corporates in the field. We have a simple view of this as an Australian government. We want Australian corporates in Africa to be model corporate citizens and to empower the governments of Africa to ensure that the regulatory conditions under which investment activity occurs is at world's best practice standards, environmentally, socially, and in proper returns financially to the governments of the region. That's what To conclude, I've often said that Africa is an important project for Australia. Many have criticised that, saying that Africa does not lie at the core of Australia's national interests. I dispute that proposition fundamentally. Why do I dispute it? Australia is a middle power with global and regional interests. Our regional interests are here in the Asia-Pacific region. Our global interests, however, lie in each continent in the world. And in an age of globalisation, it is absolute foolhardiness and blindness to believe that either Africa or Latin America, for that matter, do not have a large part in shaping the future health of the global economy. When we look at the future of major economies like Brazil and Mexico, are we to conclude, for example, that Latin America is not relevant to Australia's economic future because it has not been part and parcel of the fabric of our relationships in the past? That would simply be irrational. Similarly with Africa, when we look at the powerhouses that we see emerging, not just in Nigeria, but in South Africa and a range of other sub-Saharan African states, so too must we be mindful of where that will go in the future. Growth rates now are high by world standards. They'll be higher in the future as governance continues to improve. So for those who argue that Australian foreign policy and its foreign economic interests should be primarily, if not exclusively, concentrated in the Asia-Pacific region, the world is indeed a very large parish. Europe is part of our future, North America is part of our future, Africa is part of our future, Latin America is part of our future. We are a middle power with global and regional interests, of which Africa is one. As both a Pacific power and an Indian Ocean power, I've always believed that Australia should never be afraid to look west. We have a gateway to Africa in Perth, which has proved itself as a builder of people-to-people links, particularly through our mining sector. We also have gateways through great academic institutions such as Latrobe and some other Australian universities who have made a point of building institutional linkages with their counterpart campuses and institutions in the continent. We also begin to see a steadfast trust and growing friendship with African nations from our recent expansion of diplomatic relations and engagement in the region. We now have significant investments through trade, humanitarian assistance and aid programs in the security and the prosperity of the peoples of Africa. There is in my mind no doubt, therefore, that the Australian people want Africa to grow and thrive. I'm an optimist for how Australia and Africa can work together productively in the future to secure a common future for both our peoples. And I look forward also to the role which African Australians are going to play in the future of our multicultural Australia. Over the years and decades to come, I look forward to seeing this Australia-Africa relationship that is closer, deeper and stronger than ever before. And as Africa Day is celebrated each year over the next 50 years, I hope we can also celebrate not just an enduring friendship and partnership between our two great continents, but one which becomes closer and closer and closer to the benefit of us all. I thank you.